Cold-blooded bikers corner a family on the highway. What the dad does leaves them speechless. The sun was setting on a long stretch of highway, casting golden hues across the horizon. David Reynolds, a devoted father and ex-military officer, was driving his family home from a weekend camping trip. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, flipping through a playlist to entertain their two kids, Mia and Jake, in the back seat. The family van was filled with laughter and the smell of toasted marshmallows lingering from their last campfire. "Can we stop for snacks, Dad?" Jake asked, peering over his mother's seat with a hopeful grin. David chuckled, glancing at the dashboard. "We'll stop at the next gas station. Can't have a road trip without some junk food." The family's lighthearted banter was interrupted when 3 motorcycles roared past them, the sound vibrating through the van. The bikers wore dark helmets, their leather jackets emblazoned with a menacing logo, a snarling wolf with blood-red eyes. They slowed down just ahead, weaving in and out of the lanes. Sarah frowned, clutching her seatbelt. "David, they're driving recklessly." David nodded, his instincts kicking in. He eased off the gas, creating more distance between their van and the bikers. But it wasn't enough. The bikers noticed the gap and slowed to match their pace, circling back to flank the van on both sides. "Are they following us?" Mia asked nervously, her voice trembling. "Stay calm, sweetheart," David said, his tone steady but firm. "Just keep your seatbelt on." The bikers began taunting them, revving their engines and gesturing mockingly. One of them, a hulking figure with a skull emblem on his helmet, pulled up alongside David's window and shouted, "Nice family you got there. Mind if we join the party?" David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He remained silent, refusing to rise to the provocation. But Sarah noticed the flicker of tension in his eyes, the same look he used to have when preparing for a mission. "David," she whispered, "what do we do?" "We don't escalate," he replied, his voice calm but commanding. "They're trying to intimidate us. Let's not give them a reason." As the van approached a remote stretch of the highway, the bikers grew bolder. One of them swerved dangerously close to the van, forcing David to brake sharply to avoid a collision. The sudden jolt caused Jake to drop his tablet, and Mia clung to her stuffed animal, tears welling in her eyes. "Hey!" Sarah shouted, her protective instincts flaring. "Leave us alone." The lead biker, Skull Helmet, laughed cruelly. Don't be like that, lady. We're just having a little fun." But the tension escalated when the bikers began forcing the van toward the shoulder, boxing them in. David's heart pounded as he realized the seriousness of the situation. He quickly scanned the area. No other cars, no witnesses, and miles of empty road ahead. "We're not stopping," David said, his voice low and resolute. Skull Helmet revved his engine and pulled in front of the van, forcing David to swerve onto the gravel shoulder. The van skidded to a halt, kicking up dust and pebbles. The bikers surrounded them, their laughter echoing in the silence. Jake and Mia huddled together in the back seat, their faces pale with fear. Sarah's hand gripped David's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "David, they're not going to let us go, are they?" David glanced at his family, then at the bikers removing their helmets, revealing their hardened faces and leering grins. His military training surged to the forefront of his mind. He knew these weren't mere pranksters, they were predators, and he couldn't afford to show weakness. "Stay in the van," David said firmly, unbuckling his seatbelt. "David, no." Sarah protested, her voice trembling. "I have to handle this," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. David stepped out of the van, standing tall despite the growing fear in his chest. His military stance was unmistakable, straight back, squared shoulders, and a gaze that could cut through steel. The bikers chuckled, mistaking his calm demeanor for naivety. Well, Skull Helmet sneered, stepping forward. "Looks like the family man has some guts after all." David's eyes flicked between the bikers, assessing their stances, their weapons, and the potential exits. He noted a crowbar in the hands of one and a chain dangling from the belt of another. His mind worked quickly, mapping out a plan. "I don't want any trouble," David said, his voice steady but loud enough to command attention. "Let my family go, and we'll forget this ever happened." The bikers erupted into laughter. "You hear that, boys? Skull Helmet said. He thinks he's in charge. David remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Skull Helmet's. He knew that the wrong move could escalate the situation, but he also knew he couldn't let them sense fear. His military instincts told him one thing: if they wanted a fight, he'd be ready. The tension builds as the bikers close in on the family, their motorcycles revving loudly. The father grips the steering wheel tightly, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror at his wife and 2 daughters in the back seat. Father, whispering to himself, stay calm. Think. Mother, panicking, what do they want? Why are they doing this? Older daughter, tearfully, Dad, I'm scared. Father, steadying his voice, it's going to be okay. Trust me. The father slowly pulls the car to the side of the road, his heart racing. The bikers encircle the vehicle, their leather jackets and tattoos adding to the intimidating atmosphere. The leader of the group, a towering man with a scar across his cheek, approaches the driver's side window. Biker leader, grinning maliciously, nice car you got here. Must cost a pretty penny. Mind sharing some of that wealth with us? Father, calmly, I don't have much cash on me, but you can take what I have. Just leave my family out of this. The leader laughs, signaling for one of his men to grab a crowbar from his bike. Biker leader, mockingly, oh, we're not just after your cash, old man. We want to have a little fun. The father's mind races. He knows he can't let this escalate. He looks back at his wife, who is clutching their daughters protectively. Father, to the leader, fine. Take me instead. Leave them alone. Biker leader, amused, brave words. But we decide how this goes. As the leader raises his hand to signal his men, the father suddenly steps out of the car. The bikers pause, taken aback by his unexpected action. Father, firmly, you want to fight someone? Fight me. But let them go. The bikers laugh, finding his courage amusing. However, there's an air of hesitation as the father squares his shoulders, his calm demeanor unsettling them. Biker leader, grinning, you've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you. The father slowly removes his jacket, revealing a tattoo on his forearm that makes the leader's smile falter. It's a military insignia. Father, coldly, I've seen men tougher than you break. Do you really want to find out what I'm capable of? The bikers exchange uneasy glances. The leader, trying to maintain control, steps closer. Biker leader, growling, you think we're scared of you? Father, stepping forward, I don't care if you're scared. But I promise if you touch my family, you'll regret it. The leader hesitates. The father's unwavering gaze and calm confidence begin to unnerve him. One of the younger bikers whispers to another, clearly nervous. Young biker, whispering, he's ex-military. We shouldn't mess with him. The leader, sensing the shift in his men, tries to save face. Biker leader, sneering, fine. You're not worth our time. Let's go, boys. The bikers reluctantly rev their engines and begin to disperse. The father watches them closely, not relaxing until they are out of sight. He exhales deeply and turns back to his family. Mother, tearfully, how did you do that? Father, hugging her, I just knew I couldn't let them hurt you. The daughters run to their father, holding him tightly. The mother wipes her tears, overwhelmed with relief and admiration. Older daughter, smiling through tears, you're the bravest dad in the world. The family gets back into the car, shaken but safe. As they drive away, the father glances at his daughters in the rearview mirror. Father, softly, I'd do anything to protect you. Boys. As the car disappears down the highway, the camera pans back to the leader of the bikers, watching from a distance. He clenches his fists, his face a mix of anger and respect. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt. The father gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. His wife reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm. Are you okay? She asked softly. He nodded, though his jaw was set, his mind replaying the tense moments over and over. His daughters were unusually quiet in the back seat. The older one finally spoke up. Dad, how did you know they would leave us alone? He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. I didn't, he admitted. But sometimes, you have to stand your ground and show people you're not afraid. The younger daughter sniffled, still holding on to her sister. You weren't scared at all? The father hesitated, a small smile breaking through his otherwise stern expression. Of course I was scared. But protecting you all matters more than anything else. His wife squeezed his arm. You were incredible back there. I don't know how you kept so calm. It's something I learned a long time ago, he said, his voice trailing off as his thoughts wandered to memories of his military training, memories he rarely shared with anyone. After several miles of driving, they reached a small roadside diner. The father pulled into the parking lot, turning off the engine. Let's take a break and get something to eat, he suggested. Inside, the diner was cozy, with the scent of coffee and pancakes lingering in the air. The family found a booth near the window. The father scanned the parking lot out of habit, ensuring no one suspicious was nearby. As they settled in, the waitress approached with a warm smile. What can I get you folks? The father glanced at his wife and daughters. What do you girls want? The daughters hesitated, still shaken, but eventually ordered pancakes and orange juice. The mother asked for coffee, while the father ordered a simple plate of eggs and toast. While they waited for their food, the father leaned back in the booth, his eyes distant. His wife noticed and reached across the table, touching his hand. What's on your mind? He sighed. I keep thinking about those bikers. Something about the way their leader acted. It didn't sit right with me. What do you mean? She asked, lowering her voice. I've dealt with men like him before. Bullies who thrive on intimidation. But he wasn't just trying to scare us, he was testing me, trying to gauge how far he could push. The mother shuddered. I'm just glad it didn't go any further. The waitress returned with their food, interrupting the conversation. The daughters slowly started eating, comforted by the normalcy of pancakes and syrup. The father took a bite of his toast, his eyes still scanning the diner and parking lot. Just as he was about to take another bite, the door to the diner swung open, and the unmistakable roar of motorcycles echoed outside. The family froze as several bikers walked in, their leather jackets and boots announcing their presence. The father tensed, his instincts kicking in. He carefully placed his fork down and leaned forward slightly, positioning himself between the bikers and his family. The leader of the group spotted him and smirked. Well, look who it is, he said loudly, drawing the attention of the other patrons. The father didn't respond, his gaze steady. The mother gripped her coffee cup, her hands shaking. The leader sauntered over to their table, his grin widening. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Not many people stand up to me like you did. I didn't do it for you, the father replied evenly. The leader chuckled. Fair enough. But you should know, I don't like being embarrassed. The father's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. The leader leaned in closer, his voice low. You think you can just walk away? It doesn't work like that. The father met his gaze, unflinching. If you're looking for trouble, you won't find it here. Let us eat in peace. The leader straightened, his grin fading. We'll see about that. He walked away, joining his group at a nearby table. The father exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the edge of the table, ready to react if needed. The mother whispered, What do we do? Stay calm, he replied quietly. Let them make the first move. The tension in the diner was palpable as the bikers laughed and talked loudly, their eyes occasionally drifting to the family. The waitress looked nervous but continued serving other customers. After a few minutes, one of the bikers stood up and walked over to the jukebox in the corner. He selected a song, and the opening notes of a rock anthem filled the room. The bikers cheered, one of them even standing up to dance mockingly. The father kept his focus on his family, urging them to finish their food quickly. But as the minutes passed, it became clear the bikers weren't going anywhere. The leader stood up, holding his coffee cup. He walked back to the family's table, his smirk returning. You've got a nice family, he said, his tone laced with menace. It'd be a shame if something happened to them. The father stood up slowly, towering over the leader. That's enough. The diner fell silent as everyone watched the confrontation. The leader didn't back down, but the father's presence was commanding. Leave us alone, the father said firmly. This is your last warning. The leader's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Or what? The father leaned in, his voice a low growl. Or you'll wish you hadn't? Before the leader could respond, one of the other bikers called out, "Boss, let's just go. We've got places to be." The leader hesitated, glancing back at his group. Finally, he sighed and stepped back. "You got lucky," he muttered, turning to leave. The bikers filed out of the diner, their departure marked by the roar of their motorcycles. The father sat back down, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The waitress approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" "We're fine," the father replied. "Thank you." As the family finished their meal and prepared to leave, the father paid the bill and left a generous tip. On the way out, he paused by the waitress. "If those guys come back, call the police," he said. "Don't try to handle them on your own." She nodded, her gratitude evident. "Thank you." Back in the car, the family drove off, the tension slowly dissipating. The mother reached over and held the father's hand, her grip firm. "You're our hero," she said softly. He smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I just did what any father would do." The family drove in silence, the tension from the diner incident still lingering in the air. The father's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind raced with thoughts about the bikers. He glanced at the rearview mirror, keeping an eye on the road behind them. "Do you think they'll follow us, Dad?" the older daughter asked, her voice trembling. The father shook his head. "I don't think so. But we're not taking any chances." The mother looked at him, concern etched on her face. "Maybe we should head to a hotel for the night, somewhere they wouldn't think to look?" He nodded. "That's a good idea. I'll find the nearest one." As they drove, the GPS guided them toward a small, family-run inn just off the highway. The father deliberately took a few detours, ensuring no one was following them. Satisfied they weren't being tailed, he pulled into the inn's parking lot. The innkeeper, an older woman with a warm smile, welcomed them as they checked in. "You folks traveling through?" she asked, handing over the room keys. "Yes," the father replied. "Just needed a place to rest for the night." "Well, you've come to the right place. It's quiet here," the woman said reassuringly. The family settled into their room, a cozy space with 2 double beds and a small sitting area. The girls sat on one bed, still visibly shaken. The mother unpacked a few essentials, while the father double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Once everything was secure, he sat down with his daughters. "I know today was scary," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always protect you." The younger daughter hugged him tightly. "I know, Dad." The older daughter hesitated before speaking. "You seemed so brave back there. How did you stay so calm?" The father took a deep breath. "It wasn't easy. But sometimes, you have to face fear head-on. If you let it control you, it can make things worse." The mother joined them, sitting beside the father. "Your dad's right. And he's the bravest person I know." The family spent the evening playing card games and talking, trying to lighten the mood. Slowly, the tension began to fade, replaced by the comfort of being together. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep, the father stepped outside to get some air. The cool night breeze helped clear his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As he stood by the car, he noticed a faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. The vehicle approached slowly, its engine barely audible. The father's instincts kicked in, and he moved to the shadows, watching carefully. The car came to a stop at the edge of the parking lot, and 2 figures stepped out. They were dressed in plain clothes, but the father recognized them immediately. It was 2 of the bikers from earlier. His heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He crouched low, using the parked cars as cover, and moved closer to hear their conversation. "Are you sure this is the place?" one of them asked. "Yeah, I saw their car when we passed by earlier," the other replied. "Boss wants us to keep an eye on them, make sure they don't cause any trouble." The father's mind raced. It was clear the bikers weren't here for a friendly visit. He needed to act fast to protect his family. Quietly, he slipped back into the inn and locked the door behind him. He woke his wife, speaking in hushed tones. "The bikers are here. They're watching us." Her eyes widened in fear. "What do we do?" "We stay calm," he said firmly. "I'll handle this. Just keep the girls safe." The father quickly grabbed his phone and called the local police. He explained the situation, providing the bikers' descriptions and their behavior at the diner. The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way. In the meantime, he positioned himself near the window, keeping an eye on the bikers outside. They hadn't made a move yet, but their presence alone was enough to keep him on edge. Minutes felt like hours as the family waited in silence. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. The bikers scrambled to their car, but the police arrived before they could leave. The father watched as the officers questioned the bikers, their authoritative presence making it clear who was in charge. After a tense exchange, the bikers were handcuffed and taken into custody. An officer approached the inn and knocked on the door. The father opened it cautiously. "Are you the one who called?" the officer asked. "Yes," the father replied. "Thank you for coming so quickly." The officer nodded. "We've been looking into this group for a while. They've been causing trouble up and down the highway. Your call might have just helped us put an end to it." Relief washed over the father as he thanked the officer. After ensuring the family was safe, the police left, taking the bikers with them. Back inside, the father sat down, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. The mother hugged him tightly, her voice trembling. "You saved us again." He smiled faintly. "I just did what needed to be done." The next morning, the family packed up and continued their journey. The girls were in brighter spirits, laughing and playing in the back seat. The mother looked at her husband, admiration in her eyes. "You're our hero," she said softly. He chuckled. "I'm just a dad doing his job." But as they drove away from the inn, the father couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had faced fear and danger head-on, proving once again that nothing mattered more than protecting his family. As the family continued their journey, the father made a point to drive cautiously, always checking his rearview mirrors. The children, though slightly calmer, were still affected by the previous night's events. The mother reached back to hold their hands, offering reassurance through her touch. "Where are we going now, Dad?" the older daughter asked, her voice steadier than before but still tinged with nervousness. "We're heading toward the next town," he replied. "I want to make sure we're far enough away from any trouble." The road ahead was quiet, stretching into the horizon with no signs of traffic. The peacefulness of the landscape felt like a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. For the first time in hours, the father allowed himself to relax, though his senses remained alert. In the back seat, the younger daughter whispered to her sister, "Do you think the bikers are really gone?" Her sister nodded, trying to sound confident. "Dad made sure of it. And the police arrested them. We're safe now." The mother turned to face them, her gentle smile a comforting beacon. "Your dad's right here, and nothing's going to happen to us as long as we stick together." The father gave her a grateful glance before returning his focus to the road. "We'll stop at a diner for breakfast soon. I think we could all use a good meal." The family's spirits lifted slightly at the mention of food, and the younger daughter even managed a small smile. "Can I get pancakes, Dad?" "Of course," he said with a grin. "Pancakes for everyone." About an hour later, they pulled into the parking lot of a quaint roadside diner. It was a far cry from the chaos of the previous night, with its welcoming neon sign and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. The family stepped inside, greeted by the warm chatter of locals enjoying their morning. They found a booth near the window, and a cheerful waitress quickly came to take their order. The father observed his surroundings carefully, noting the friendly faces and the absence of any suspicious activity. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe easily. As the waitress brought their food, the father noticed an older man sitting at the counter. The man wore a leather jacket, but it was clear he wasn't part of any biker gang. Instead, his demeanor was calm and introspective, as though he had stories to tell but no one to listen. The father's gaze lingered for a moment, and the older man caught his eye. He gave a polite nod, which the father returned before focusing back on his family. "Everything okay?" the mother asked, sensing his thoughts. "Yeah," he replied. "Just making sure." The family enjoyed their breakfast, the children laughing over syrupy pancakes and the mother sipping her coffee with a look of contentment. It was a much-needed moment of normalcy after the chaos they had endured. As they finished their meal, the older man from the counter approached their table. He stood at a respectful distance, his hands in his pockets. "Morning," he said, his voice deep but friendly. "I couldn't help but notice you folks seem a bit on edge. Everything all right? The father hesitated before responding. We had a run-in with some troublemakers last night. But everything's fine now. The older man nodded knowingly. This stretch of highway can be unpredictable. I've been traveling it for years, and I've seen my fair share of incidents. The father studied him carefully. You seem like someone who knows how to handle themselves. The man chuckled. Let's just say I've been around long enough to know when to stand my ground and when to walk away. The mother interjected, her curiosity piqued. What brings you here? The man smiled. I'm just passing through, same as you. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't let fear control you. Trouble has a way of finding you, whether you're ready for it or not. The father nodded in agreement. That's true. The man tipped his head toward the exit. Well, you folks take care. And if you ever find yourselves in a tight spot again, just remember, family comes first. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the family with a sense of reassurance. The father watched him go, his words resonating deeply. As they paid their bill and prepared to leave, the mother placed a hand on her husband's arm. That man seemed like he knew what he was talking about. The father nodded. He reminded me of someone. Someone who's been through battles and come out stronger. The family continued their journey, the highway stretching out before them like a ribbon of endless possibilities. The father drove with renewed determination, his focus sharper than ever. Hours passed, and the family found themselves in a small town nestled between rolling hills. The father decided it was a good place to stop and rest. They checked into a cozy motel, its vintage charm a comforting change from the chaos they had left behind. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the family gathered on the motel's porch to watch the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The children played with a deck of cards, their laughter filling the air, while the parents sat together, reflecting on the events of the past 24 hours. We've been through a lot, the mother said softly. But I'm proud of how we handled it. The father smiled, his arm around her shoulders. We're stronger than we think. And as long as we stick together, there's nothing we can't face. The family stayed up late that night, sharing stories and dreams for the future. The weight of their recent ordeal seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of unity and resilience. The next morning, as they prepared to leave the motel, the father noticed a small note tucked under their windshield wiper. He unfolded it, reading the handwritten message. Stay strong. You've got what it takes. There was no signature, but the father had a feeling he knew who it was from. He smiled, tucking the note into his pocket as a reminder of the strength they had found as a family. As they drove away, the father glanced at his wife and children, his heart swelling with gratitude. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear, but they had come out the other side stronger and closer than ever. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The family continued their drive through the winding roads, the tension of the past few days slowly giving way to a renewed sense of calm. The younger daughter leaned her head against the car window, watching the world blur by, while the older daughter played a quiet game on her tablet. The father kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind still alert. Although the worst seemed to be behind them, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The note left on their car had been comforting, but it also reminded him that someone out there was still watching. Do you think we'll make it to Grandma's by tonight? The older daughter asked, breaking the silence. The mother smiled gently, turning to look at her. We'll try, sweetheart. But if we don't, we'll find a safe place to stop. Safe, the father echoed under his breath, his grip tightening momentarily on the steering wheel. The highway ahead was largely empty, save for a few trucks rumbling in the distance. The family had made it far enough from the town where they'd encountered the bikers, and the peaceful surroundings gave them a small sense of relief. Yet, every so often, the father would glance in the rearview mirror, scanning for any signs of trouble. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, they pulled into a gas station to refuel. The father stepped out of the car, stretching his legs before heading to the pump. The mother got out as well, guiding the girls toward the small convenience store for snacks. Inside the store, the atmosphere was calm. The mother browsed the aisles with the girls, letting them choose their favorite treats. The younger daughter held up a brightly colored bag of gummy bears. Can I get this one? Of course, the mother said, ruffling her hair. Meanwhile, outside, the father finished pumping gas and leaned against the car, taking in the quiet surroundings. He noticed a lone motorcyclist parked at the far edge of the lot. Unlike the gang they had encountered earlier, this biker seemed solitary, more focused on cleaning the dust off his helmet than causing trouble. The biker glanced up and caught the father's eye. There was no hostility in his gaze, just a brief acknowledgement before he returned to his task. The father relaxed slightly, though he remained cautious. When the mother and children returned with their snacks, the family piled back into the car, ready to continue their journey. As they pulled onto the road, the father couldn't help but glance at the motorcyclist one last time. The man was watching them, his expression unreadable, before he mounted his bike and rode off in the opposite direction. Back on the highway, the family's spirits began to lift again. The girls played a game of I Spy, their laughter filling the car, while the mother shared stories from her own childhood, bringing smiles to everyone's faces. But as dusk settled, the father's unease returned. The quietness of the road felt almost too perfect, too devoid of the usual hum of passing cars. He kept his eyes trained on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of a motorcycle or the roaring engines of a gang closing in. "What's wrong?" the mother asked, noticing his tension. "Nothing," he replied quickly. "Just staying cautious." As they rounded a bend, the father's heart sank. In the distance, a group of motorcycles was parked along the side of the road. The bikers stood in a loose circle, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. The father slowed the car, his mind racing. "Stay calm," he said, his voice steady. "We'll just drive past them." The mother nodded, her hand instinctively reaching back to hold the girl's hands. The children, sensing the change in atmosphere, fell silent. As the car approached the group, one of the bikers stepped onto the road, signaling for them to stop. The father's jaw tightened, but he slowed the car to a halt, his heart pounding in his chest. The biker approached the driver's side window, his face obscured by a helmet. He tapped on the glass, and the father hesitated before rolling it down slightly. "Evening," the biker said, his voice muffled. "You folks doing okay?" The father's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We're fine. Just passing through." The biker tilted his head, studying the family inside the car. "Had some trouble on the highway last night, didn't you?" The mother's breath caught, and the father's heart raced. "How do you know about that?" The biker stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just heard some chatter from the local precinct. They said a family ran into some bikers who didn't know how to mind their own business." The father frowned, unsure of whether to trust him. "And you?" The biker chuckled, removing his helmet to reveal a weathered face and kind eyes. "I'm not with them, if that's what you're asking. Just a guy who keeps an eye on things around here." The father studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "We're fine. Thanks for your concern." The biker stepped aside, waving them on. "Safe travels, then. And don't let those idiots scare you off the road." The family drove away, the tension in the car palpable. The father kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the biker to follow, but he stayed behind with the group, watching them leave. "That was strange," the mother said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah," the father replied, his mind still racing. "But at least he wasn't hostile." The highway stretched on, the night growing darker with each passing mile. The family eventually found a small roadside motel and decided to stop for the night. The father checked them in, ensuring the room was secure before allowing himself to relax. As they settled in, the girls fell asleep quickly, their small forms curled up under the covers. The mother sat beside the father, her hand resting on his arm. "We've been through a lot," she said softly. "But we're still here. Together." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the window. "Yeah. And I'll make sure it stays that way." As the family settled into the small motel room, the father finally allowed himself to relax. The stress of the past few days had been relentless, and every muscle in his body felt heavy with exhaustion. He glanced over at the girls, who were fast asleep on one of the beds, their innocent faces illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. The mother, sitting beside him, placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Get some rest." He nodded, though his mind was still racing. "I'll try." After turning off the lamp, the room fell into a quiet stillness. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of the sheets as the girls shifted in their sleep. The father lay down, his eyes staring at the ceiling as his thoughts replayed the events of the past 2 days. Despite the biker's reassurance, a nagging feeling of unease lingered in his chest. Morning arrived quicker than expected. The family woke up early, eager to continue their journey. After a quick breakfast at the motel diner, they loaded their belongings into the car and hit the road. The sun was shining, and the day seemed promising, a stark contrast to the tension-filled hours they'd endured previously. As they drove, the girls resumed their game of I Spy, their laughter filling the car. The father's grip on the wheel loosened, and even the mother seemed more at ease. The highway stretched out before them, with rolling hills and patches of greenery on either side. But the peace didn't last long. About an hour into their drive, the father noticed something in the rearview mirror. A single motorcycle was trailing them at a distance. His heart skipped a beat as he watched the bike move closer, its sleek black frame glinting in the sunlight. The highway ahead was largely empty, save for a few trucks rumbling in the distance. The family had made it far enough from the town where they'd encountered the bikers, and the peaceful surroundings gave them a small sense of relief. Yet, every so often, the father would glance in the rearview mirror, scanning for any signs of trouble. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, they pulled into a gas station to refuel. The father stepped out of the car, stretching his legs before heading to the pump. The mother got out as well, guiding the girls toward the small convenience store for snacks. Inside the store, the atmosphere was calm. The mother browsed the aisles with the girls, letting them choose their favorite treats. The younger daughter held up a brightly colored bag of gummy bears. "Can I get this one?" "Of course," the mother said, ruffling her hair. Meanwhile, outside, the father finished pumping gas and leaned against the car, taking in the quiet surroundings. He noticed a lone motorcyclist parked at the far edge of the lot. Unlike the gang they had encountered earlier, this biker seemed solitary, more focused on cleaning the dust off his helmet than causing trouble. The biker glanced up and caught the father's eye. There was no hostility in his gaze, just a brief acknowledgement before he returned to his task. The father relaxed slightly, though he remained cautious. When the mother and children returned with their snacks, the family piled back into the car, ready to continue their journey. As they pulled onto the road, the father couldn't help but glance at the motorcyclist one last time. The man was watching them, his expression unreadable, before he mounted his bike and rode off in the opposite direction. Back on the highway, the family's spirits began to lift again. The girls played a game of I Spy, their laughter filling the car, while the mother shared stories from her own childhood, bringing smiles to everyone's faces. But as dusk settled, the father's unease returned. The quietness of the road felt almost too perfect, too devoid of the usual hum of passing cars. He kept his eyes trained on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of a motorcycle or the roaring engines of a gang closing in. "What's wrong?" the mother asked, noticing his tension. "Nothing," he replied quickly. "Just staying cautious." As they rounded a bend, the father's heart sank. In the distance, a group of motorcycles was parked along the side of the road. The bikers stood in a loose circle, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. The father slowed the car, his mind racing. "Stay calm," he said, his voice steady. "We'll just drive past them." The mother nodded, her hand instinctively reaching back to hold the girls' hands. The children, sensing the change in atmosphere, fell silent. As the car approached the group, one of the bikers stepped onto the road, signaling for them to stop. The father's jaw tightened, but he slowed the car to a halt, his heart pounding in his chest. The biker approached the driver's side window, his face obscured by a helmet. He tapped on the glass, and the father hesitated before rolling it down slightly. "Evening," the biker said, his voice muffled. "You folks doing okay?" The father's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We're fine. Just passing through." The biker tilted his head, studying the family inside the car. "Had some trouble on the highway last night, didn't you?" The mother's breath caught, and the father's heart raced. How do you know about that? The biker stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just heard some chatter from the local precinct. They said a family ran into some bikers who didn't know how to mind their own business. The father frowned, unsure of whether to trust him. And you? The biker chuckled, removing his helmet to reveal a weathered face and kind eyes. I'm not with them, if that's what you're asking. Just a guy who keeps an eye on things around here. The father studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. We're fine. Thanks for your concern. The biker stepped aside, waving them on. Safe travels, then. And don't let those idiots scare you off the road. The family drove away, the tension in the car palpable. The father kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the biker to follow, but he stayed behind with the group, watching them leave. That was strange, the mother said softly, breaking the silence. Yeah, the father replied, his mind still racing. But at least he wasn't hostile. The highway stretched on, the night growing darker with each passing mile. The family eventually found a small roadside motel and decided to stop for the night. The father checked them in, ensuring the room was secure before allowing himself to relax. As they settled in, the girls fell asleep quickly, their small forms curled up under the covers. The mother sat beside the father, her hand resting on his arm. We've been through a lot, she said softly. But we're still here. Together. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the window. Yeah. And I'll make sure it stays that way. As the family settled into the small motel room, the father finally allowed himself to relax. The stress of the past few days had been relentless, and every muscle in his body felt heavy with exhaustion. He glanced over at the girls, who were fast asleep on one of the beds, their innocent faces illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. The mother, sitting beside him, placed a comforting hand on his arm. You've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Get some rest. He nodded, though his mind was still racing. I'll try. After turning off the lamp, the room fell into a quiet stillness. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of the sheets as the girls shifted in their sleep. The father lay down, his eyes staring at the ceiling as his thoughts replayed the events of the past 2 days. Despite the biker's reassurance, a nagging feeling of unease lingered in his chest. Morning arrived quicker than expected. The family woke up early, eager to continue their journey. After a quick breakfast at the motel diner, they loaded their belongings into the car and hit the road. The sun was shining, and the day seemed promising. A stark contrast to the tension-filled hours they'd endured previously. As they drove, the girls resumed their game of I Spy, their laughter filling the car. The father's grip on the wheel loosened, and even the mother seemed more at ease. The highway stretched out before them, with rolling hills and patches of greenery on either side. But the peace didn't last long. About an hour into their drive, the father noticed something in the rearview mirror. A single motorcycle was trailing them at a distance. His heart skipped a beat as he watched the bike move closer, its sleek black frame glinting in the sunlight. Is it them? The mother asked, her voice tight with worry. I'm not sure, the father replied, his tone cautious. It could just be a coincidence. But as the miles rolled by, the motorcycle remained behind them, never overtaking or falling too far back. The father's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his pulse quickening. Eventually, the motorcycle sped up, pulling alongside their car. The father tensed, his eyes darting between the road and the biker. But as the motorcycle drew level with the driver's window, the biker turned his head slightly, giving the family a casual nod before accelerating and disappearing down the highway. The father exhaled, his body relaxing slightly. Just a random biker, he muttered, trying to convince himself as much as his family. The mother let out a shaky laugh. You're starting to see ghosts? But the father couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. A few hours later, they stopped at a rest area for lunch. The girls ran to the small playground nearby, their giggles echoing through the air. The mother unpacked a cooler filled with sandwiches and juice boxes, setting up a picnic table under the shade of a tree. As they ate, the father scanned the parking lot, his eyes darting from car to car. He couldn't see any motorcycles, but his instincts told him to stay alert. You need to relax, the mother said, placing a hand on his arm. "We're safe here." "I know," he replied, though his eyes remained on the road. "I just can't help it." After lunch, the family piled back into the car, ready to continue their journey. The highway stretched on, and as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, the father allowed himself to relax slightly. Maybe the worst was truly behind them. But as they rounded a bend, his heart sank. In the distance, a group of motorcycles was parked on the side of the road. The bikers stood in a loose circle, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. The father slowed the car, his mind racing with possibilities. "Not again," the mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay calm," the father said, his tone firm. "We'll just keep driving." As they approached the group, one of the bikers stepped into the middle of the road, raising a hand to signal them to stop. The father hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to drive past. But the narrow stretch of road made it impossible to maneuver around them. The car rolled to a stop, and the father took a deep breath before lowering the window slightly. The biker leaned down, his face obscured by a dark visor. "Evening," the biker said, his voice gruff. "Where you folks headed?" The father kept his tone steady. "Just passing through." The biker nodded, straightening up. "You had some trouble with a few of my friends the other night?" The father's stomach dropped. "We don't want any trouble." The biker chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Trouble has a way of finding you, doesn't it?" At that moment, the mother leaned over, her voice firm. "We have children in the car. Please, just let us pass." The biker tilted his head, as if considering her words. Then he stepped back, motioning for the other bikers to clear the road. The family waited, their breaths held, as the motorcycles revved their engines and moved aside. "You have a good evening now," the biker said, tipping his helmet slightly before walking back to his group. The father didn't need to be told twice. He pressed the gas pedal, and the car sped away, leaving the bikers in the rearview mirror. The family drove in silence, the tension in the car palpable. "I don't think they'll follow us," the mother said after a few minutes, her voice shaky but hopeful. "I hope not," the father replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As the highway stretched on, the bikers remained behind, their figures fading into the distance. The family's ordeal seemed to be over, but the father couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only narrowly escaped something far worse. The family drove in silence for another hour, the tension in the car still thick. The girls had stopped playing their game of I Spy, and the mother stared out the window, her fingers nervously tapping on the armrest. The father, though relieved they'd left the bikers behind, kept checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. As night began to fall, they decided to stop at a larger town and find a proper hotel to stay in. The father wanted to put more distance between them and the events of the day, but the mother insisted they needed rest, especially for the girls. They pulled into a well-lit parking lot of a chain hotel. The mother took the girls inside to check in while the father stayed in the car, his eyes scanning the area. Every shadow seemed menacing, every passing motorcycle causing his heartbeat to quicken. Finally, the mother returned with a room key, and they all made their way to the second-floor room. It was simple but comfortable, and the girls immediately jumped on the beds, giggling and pretending the past few days hadn't happened. "We'll order some room service and call it a night," the mother suggested, her voice steady as she unpacked some essentials. "We've all earned a good night's sleep." The father nodded, though he still seemed on edge. He double-checked the locks on the door and even placed a chair under the handle, just in case. The mother didn't comment, understanding his paranoia. Room service arrived, and for the first time in days, the family had a warm meal together. The girls talked about their favorite parts of the road trip so far, completely oblivious to the dangers they'd narrowly avoided. Their innocence was a relief to both parents, who were determined to shield them from the worst of the world. Just as they were finishing up dinner, there was a sudden knock at the door. The room fell silent. The father's heart raced as he stood up, motioning for the mother and girls to stay quiet. He approached the door cautiously, looking through the peephole. At first, all he could see was a dark figure standing just out of view. Then, the figure stepped closer, and the father's stomach churned. It was one of the bikers. The father whispered, "It's them," his voice barely audible. The mother's face turned pale as she ushered the girls into the bathroom, locking the door behind them. The father took a deep breath and opened the door slightly, his hand gripping the edge tightly. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. The biker, still wearing his helmet, held up both hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice muffled by the visor. "We don't have anything to talk about," the father replied, his grip tightening. The biker tilted his head slightly. "You don't want to hear what I have to say?" "Not interested." The biker let out a soft laugh. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you should know that not all of us agree with how things went down back there." The father frowned, his confusion briefly overriding his fear. "What are you talking about?" "Not all of us are as aggressive as some of the others," the biker explained. "I came here to warn you." "Warn us about what?" the father asked, his voice sharper now. "They're not done with you," the biker said, his tone serious. "Some of the guys, they're looking to settle a score. They think you disrespected them." "We didn't do anything," the father argued, his frustration evident. "That doesn't matter to them," the biker replied. "They're looking for a fight, and they don't care who gets hurt." The father felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. "Why are you telling me this?" The biker hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I've got kids of my own. I wouldn't want them to go through something like this." The father stared at him, trying to gauge if he was being sincere. "So what are we supposed to do?" "Leave," the biker said simply. "Tonight. Don't wait until morning. Get as far away from here as you can." The father nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Thank you." The biker gave a small nod in return before turning and walking away. The father watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. Once the biker was out of sight, the father locked the door again and hurried to the bathroom. He knocked softly, and the mother opened the door, her face filled with worry. "We have to leave," he said urgently. "No." The mother didn't argue. She quickly gathered their things while the father explained what had happened. The girls, though confused, obeyed their parents without question. Within 15 minutes, they were back in the car, driving away from the hotel. The father kept the headlights off until they were far enough from the parking lot, not wanting to draw any attention. As they drove through the darkened streets, the father kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a line of motorcycles behind them. But the road remained empty. The family drove through the night, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks. The father's exhaustion was palpable, but his determination to keep his family safe overpowered his need for rest. The mother offered to drive, but he shook his head. "I need to be the one behind the wheel," he said firmly. By the time the sun began to rise, they had crossed state lines and were well on their way to a larger city. The father finally allowed himself to relax, though only slightly. The mother leaned over and squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing," she said softly. The father nodded, though he didn't respond. His thoughts were still focused on keeping his family safe. They eventually found a new hotel, this one in a busy urban area where they felt less isolated. The father parked the car in a secured lot, double-checking the locks before they went inside. The mother checked them in while the father stayed with the girls, who were still groggy from the long drive. Once they were in their room, the father collapsed onto the bed, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion. The mother tucked the girls in before sitting beside him, her hand brushing his hair back gently. "We're safe now," she whispered. The father closed his eyes, his breathing steadying. "I hope so," he murmured. For the first time in days, the family slept peacefully, the events of the past few days feeling like a distant nightmare. But the father knew that the world was full of dangers, and he silently vowed to always protect his family, no matter what it took.